A rain-slicked village road near Reims in September 1944 offers no soft welcome to an advancing army. Beside a shattered stone wall stands Pierre Dupont, a 7-year-old orphan wearing oversized adult military boots and holding a toy rifle carved from pine wood. As a three-star command jeep grinding through the thick mud comes into view, the young boy steps toward the gravel edge, snaps his small heels together, and raises a rigid military salute with his crude wooden weapon. In the long convoy behind the flagship vehicle, staff officers and drivers freeze in their seats. Hands remain locked on steering wheels and eyes shift nervously toward the passenger side of the lead vehicle. Everyone bracing for how the notoriously fierce commander will react to a civilian delay on an active military supply route. Men who have seen General George S. Patton, Jr. enforce ruthless discipline for the smallest uniform infraction, hold their breath as the heavy jeep skids to a sudden halt in the loose gravel. Patton slowly turns his head and fixes his sharp gaze on the child. He does not smile. He does not bark an order. The low rumble of idling diesel engines suddenly feels muffled against the cold country air. What happened in the next 60 seconds would reveal the unexpected depth beneath the legendary general's iron exterior. And the answer was not what anyone on that road was prepared for. If you want more untold stories from World War II, hit that subscribe button. Let me back up a second. Because to understand what it cost a 7-year-old orphan to stand on that roadside and hold his ground, you need to understand what a forward military supply route in September 1944 actually was. This was not a quiet French countryside backroad. It was an active artery for the Third Army, jammed with heavy transport vehicles, armored reconnaissance cars, and supply trucks pushing eastward toward the German border. The movement was constant, loud, and relentless. The air smelled of diesel exhaust, wet wool, and pulverized stone. Every driver in that convoy was pushing hard against time, racing to deliver fuel, ammunition, and rations to divisions operating right at the edge of their operational limits. In that world, civilian roads were strictly military corridors. The unwritten rule for local populations was simple: step back, clear the shoulder. Get out of the way of the rolling steel. A military convoy on the move does not stop for stray livestock, ruined cartwheels, or curious bystanders. For a young child, standing mere inches from passing treads and spinning tires was dangerous. For that child to deliberately step forward, hold a carved wooden weapon to his chest, and snap to attention was a complete rupture of the environment's unwritten protocol. Every soldier riding in the back of those trucks knew the absolute distance between a three-star general and a local civilian. You do not block the path of a theater commander. You do not disrupt the movement of an advancing army for a personal gesture. The officers surrounding the general had seen him enforce strict discipline for minor uniform violations. They knew his reputation for fiery intensity and absolute focus on speed. Now, look at the operational stakes of that month. In September 1944, General Patton's Third Army was locked in a brutal logistics crisis. Fuel supplies had dwindled to critical levels across the European theater. Every gallon of gasoline was calculated down to the mile. Every hour lost on a congested road meant units at the front lines were forced to halt their advance. The military arithmetic was unforgiving. A 15-minute delay along a major supply line could ripple backward, stalling dozens of vehicles, burning hundreds of gallons of idle fuel, and displacing thousands of artillery shells that were desperately needed at the front. The cost of stopping a convoy was measured directly in time and operational momentum, and that was the road where Pierre Dupont stood holding his carved toy rifle. Picture the scene. It is mid-afternoon on a narrow French road, flanked by stone cottages scarred by artillery fire. The rain has stopped, but the ground remains a soup of heavy brown mud. Engine heat radiates off the long line of idling trucks, mixing with the sharp odor of exhaust fumes and damp wool. Inside the lead jeep, sitting beside General Patton, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Codman shifts uncomfortably in his seat. His hand rests on the vehicle's cold metal doorframe. Codman looks past the windshield at the small figure in the road. The officers and drivers sitting in the column behind them are staring through wiped windshields, watching the passenger side of the flagship vehicle. They know Patton's reputation for relentless drive and absolute intolerance for delay. They have seen him berate officers for minor uniform flaws and push men past the point of exhaustion to keep the Third Army moving. Nobody moves. The colonels in the command cars look at Patton's rigid profile. The drivers look at the young boy standing in the mud with his wooden rifle. Everyone is making the same silent calculation, wondering how a general who lives for velocity will handle an obstruction that weighs less than 60 pounds. Stay with me because what happened next on that gravel shoulder is the part nobody was expecting. The accounts that survive are consistent in shape. Patton reached for the handle and stepped out of the idling jeep into the deep French mud. He stood tall beside the vehicle, his long wool coat dark with road spray. The silence along the column tightened like a pulled wire. Nobody moved, nobody breathed. He walked past the front fender, his three-star helmet gleaming beneath the grey sky. He stepped straight up to the small boy standing by the stone wall, not the way a general looks at an obstruction on a military highway, not the way a commander looks at a delay in his supply chain. He looked at the child the way he looked at a veteran soldier standing inspection on a parade deck. He stopped 2 paces away. He did not speak. The general raised his right hand to the rim of his helmet and delivered a crisp, formal military salute. For 3 seconds, the five-star commander and the 7-year-old orphan held each other's gaze across the muddy shoulder. Then Patton lowered his hand and reached down to his spare service tunic hanging over the rear backrest of his jeep. With steady hands, he unseated the red, white, and blue insignia of the Third Army. He leaned over, took the boy by the shoulder of his frayed woolen coat, and pinned the embroidered cloth patch directly over the child's chest. He stepped back, adjusted the child's oversized coat, and spoke 2 words. "Carry on." Lieutenant Colonel Codman described that brief interaction in his journal with a single word: unforgettable. See, what most folks don't realize is that Patton was not reacting to a child playing dress-up on a back road. He was reading the situation through a very specific lens. Patton was a historian and a romantic, but above all, he was a man obsessed with military discipline, honor, and duty. To anyone else, Pierre was just a displaced orphan holding a piece of pine wood. But to Patton, that small boy standing straight in oversized adult boots represented something far larger. He saw a child who had lost his home, his family, and his future to the devastation of war, yet still chose to stand tall, hold his ground, and honor the soldiers who had come to liberate his land. The military arithmetic of that moment was simple. Halting that convoy cost 60 seconds. It burned less than a quarter-gallon of idle fuel across 3 command vehicles. But the value of that gesture was impossible to measure on an overlay map. In a war defined by staggering statistics, destruction, and mechanical movement, Patton recognized a moment of pure, unsullied human dignity. The quiet response was not an interruption to the war effort. It was the entire reason the war was being fought. Pierre Dupont was born in June 1937 on a small dairy farm 3 miles outside Reims. His father, Marc Dupont, was a quiet, thick-wristed stone mason who spent his 6-day work weeks dressing limestone for local building foundations. Marc was a man who believed in absolute structural integrity, teaching his young son that a wall was either plumb or it was garbage. From his father, Pierre learned a rigid, silent discipline, absorbing the idea that work was meant to be done correctly, regardless of who was watching. His mother, Helene, tended the garden and mended clothes with meticulous care, ensuring that even in hard times, Pierre's woolen coats were neatly patched. When the war swept through northeastern France, it obliterated the small farm. Both of Pierre's parents were killed during a sudden, chaotic artillery duel in the summer of 1944. Leaving the 7-year-old completely alone in the world. He was taken in by distant relatives living in a damaged cottage near the main highway. He spent his days wandering the gravel roads, wearing his late father's adult military boots and holding that toy rifle carved from pine wood, the last physical object his father had crafted before the shelling began. He was not a child playing games, he was the child of a stone mason, standing duty over the ruins of his home. When Pierre returned to the cottage that evening and showed his guardians the embroidered shoulder patch pinned to his coat, he did not boast. He did not tell a grand story. When asked about the tall American general in the 3-star helmet, the boy simply adjusted his coat and said he had been given proper recognition by an officer who understood how to stand guard. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Codman recorded the brief interaction in his personal diary that night, marveling at how a 59-year-old general known for his explosive temper had treated an orphaned French child with the solemn reverence of a military review. Codman survived the war and returned to his home in Boston, frequently sharing the story of the gravel road near Reims as proof of the hidden warmth that existed beneath Patton's formidable exterior. Codman passed away in 1948, but his written account preserved a fleeting moment where the Iron General allowed his humanity to shine through the dust of war. Was Patton right to stop a strategic supply column to acknowledge a child? Some would say no. In an operation where single gallons of gasoline and fractions of an hour determined whether division advances lived or died, halting an army command element for a civilian orphan was an unnecessary breach of discipline that risked real operational momentum on a critical corridor. Others would say exactly the opposite. They would argue that an army devoid of human purpose is merely a machine of destruction, and that by stopping to honor a child's courage, Patton reinforced the very values of duty, sacrifice, and dignity his men were dying to defend. Let us know in the comments below, and if you want more untold stories from World War II, make sure you subscribe.